We are about to begin an extensive exploration of what might be one of the most resilient stories in modern culture.
Right.
And that's the foundational belief that world governments, specifically the U.S. government, are actively suppressing undeniable evidence of extraterrestrial technology or intelligence.
And what's so interesting is that this idea, this cover-up story, is so deeply embedded now that for a lot of people, it's become the main focus.
It's the central drama.
Exactly. It's not even about the unidentified phenomena themselves anymore. It's about the conspiracy.
That's a great point. And what we're doing here today is a thorough analysis of the source material we have, tracing the complete historical timeline of how this really intricate, multi-layered narrative of government suppression was constructed.
And not just constructed, but intentionally amplified and then maintained across decades of huge cultural and political shifts. It's a story that has a surprisingly long and frankly manufactured history.
Yeah.
It actually predates the famous flying saucer sightings of the late 1940s.
Before we jump into that chronology, I think it's important to establish the scientific and skeptical context here.
Sure.
The overarching view from organizations like the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry is pretty clear.
Right.
It's that there is little to no verifiable physical evidence to support these massive conspiratorial claims, claims of alien visitation and retrieval programs.
And that's despite decades of research and intense scrutiny from, non-governmental scientific agencies.
Yep.
But the cultural impact is it's undeniable.
Absolutely.
And to really understand why these theories are so resilient, we have to go right back to the moment the narrative of secrecy was actually born.
Where does it start?
It starts with a feeling of powerlessness. In October 1947, a man named Richard Shaver, writing in Amazing Stories magazine, basically stated the thesis that would fuel this entire saga for the next 80 years.
What did he write?
He wrote, and I'm quoting here, "The truth of what the strange disk ships really are will never be disclosed to the common people. We just don't count to the people who do know about such things." Wow. And that feeling right there, that the powerful have the truth and the public is irrelevant, that is the founding principle of the entire cover-up conspiracy narrative.
Okay, so let's unpack that and rewind to the literal birth of this narrative, which is really in the pages of pulp science fiction. The origins are truly bizarre.
They really are.
And they center around a man named Raymond Palmer, who sources often call the man who invented flying saucers.
Which is a bold claim, but there's a reason for it. He was publishing accounts of strange advanced craft in his magazine, Amazing Stories, before 1947, before it all exploded.
So he was kind of preceding the whole idea.
Palmer's role was absolutely instrumental because he very successfully blurred the lines between fictional adventure and what he presented as journalistic investigation.
How did he do that?
He established this foundation by drawing heavily on what historians of esotericism call lost continent myths.
Like Atlantis.
Exactly, Atlantis and Lemuria.
Yeah.
And that allowed him to posit these ancient non-human origins for advanced technology.
And the centerpiece of this pre-saucer lore was something called the Shaver mystery.
Yes. This involved Richard Shaver, the man I quoted earlier. He was a welder from Pennsylvania, and he claimed he was in constant telepathic communication with a secret underground race.
An underground race.
Yes. Shaver claimed these inhabitants, he called them the Dinero, or detrimental robots, were the degenerated descendants of an ancient spacefaring civilization that had survived some catastrophic flood.
And they were responsible for the strange things people were seeing.
That was his claim. He alleged they had mastered space travel and were, in fact, responsible for phenomena like the strange lights and craft people sometimes saw.
No, what's crucial for understanding the genesis of the cover-up narrative here is Shaver's personal history.
Right. This is not to ridicule the man, but to understand the raw material Palmer was working with. Shaver had been hospitalized for psychiatric problems back in 1934.
And Palmer knew this.
Oh, yes. Palmer would later acknowledge that Shaver had spent 8 years in a mental institution being treated for paranoid schizophrenia.
So Palmer presented these stories as factual reports from a man who had this history.
He did. He framed it as Shaver having genuinely suffered this trauma, which gave him access to these truths. And by doing that, he effectively erased the boundary between fact and fantasy for a very receptive post-war readership that was looking for new explanations for things.
In fact, Palmer himself, long before the first major sighting, was already advocating for a government conspiracy.
He was. A full year before the media frenzy, in a July 1946 editorial, Palmer argued that, and I quote, Responsible parties and world governments were already aware of spaceships visiting Earth, but were actively concealing the information.
So the idea of a cover-up was already in the air, put there by Palmer.
Exactly. So when pilot Kenneth Arnold reported seeing those 9 supersonic crescent-shaped flying discs near Mount Rainier in June 1947, the public imagination was already culturally primed by Palmer and Shaver.
They were ready to see it as something ancient, advanced, and something the government already knew about.
Precisely. Arnold's sighting gave us the term flying saucers, and it instantly triggered hundreds, maybe thousands, of highly publicized copycat reports.
And at first, the speculation wasn't about aliens, was it?
No, initially the media focused on whether these discs were advanced secret technology from the American military or, more ominously, from the Soviets.
But that narrative quickly hardened into something far more sinister.
It did. Right on the heels of that initial sighting came the first major hoax and one of the first explicit instances of the cover-up narrative.
The Maury Island hoax.
July 1947. This event is a foundational pillar for the entire Men in Black mythology.
So Palmer, seeing this opportunity, hired Kenneth Arnold, the original witness, to investigate a wild report near Maury Island, Washington.
He did. The report came from a man named Fred Chrisman, who Palmer had already published letters from, claiming he'd battled inhuman underground monsters in Burma. So he was already a character in this world.
And Chrisman's story was what?
Chrisman told Arnold a story about a flying disc that was shedding rock-like debris, which injured his friend, Harold Dahl, and tragically killed their dog.
And here's the kernel of the conspiracy that would grow into this huge tree of suppression.
This is it. Chrisman claimed that immediately after the disc incident, a mysterious black-clad stranger showed up and threatened him.
Told him to be silent.
Gave him instructions to be absolutely silent about the incident. This is the clear, direct precursor, the blueprint for the entire Men in Black concept that would emerge years later. The message was simple: speak about the mystery, and you will be silenced.
And then a real tragedy happened, which gave the story weight.
It did. Arnold summoned 2 Air Force investigators, Captain Davidson and Lieutenant Brown. They took possession of the supposed debris, which was described as basically lava rocks from Chrisman.
And their plane crashed.
Critically, as those 2 investigators were returning to base, their B-25 plane caught fire and crashed near Tacoma, killing them both.
A local newspaper immediately suggested the plane had been sabotaged.
Or shot down, specifically to prevent the debris from being analyzed. Now, Chrisman, under police scrutiny, later confessed that the entire thing was a calculated hoax.
He and Dahl had just made it up.
Correct. But historian Curtis Peebles argues powerfully that this Maury Island incident was the first event to infuse a sinister air or a conspiratorial atmosphere into the flying saucer myth.
So even though it was a confessed hoax, the template was created.
The template was set. And it's truly remarkable how durable this initial fiction became. Decades later, Palmer himself explicitly connected the dots.
What did he say?
In a 1976 letter, Palmer wrote, "There is a definite link between flying saucers, the Shaver mystery, the Kennedy's assassinations, Watergate, and Fred Chrisman."
Wow. So for the originators, it was all one big, continuous story.
A single line of events linking the 1940s directly to the political disillusionment of the 1970s.
So as we move into the 1950s, the focus, it shifts pretty sharply. It goes from the bizarre pulp novelty of Richard Shaver to explicit public accusations aimed directly at the government.
Yes, and this shift, which really popularized the idea that the Air Force was lying, was primarily led by one man, Donald Keyhoe.
Who was he?
Keyhoe was a former Marine major and an aviation writer. So he was a game changer because he spoke with the authority of a military man, which lent a lot of credibility to the extraterrestrial hypothesis.
His work began in 1949 with a magazine article, right?
That's right. December 1949, in True magazine, the article is called "The Flying Saucers Are Real." It wasn't just a sensation, it offered a definitive conclusion.
That the discs were interplanetary.
Interplanetary, and that the Air Force was intentionally withholding that knowledge from the public.
And what was the rationale they gave for the cover-up?
The fear of public panic. They often drew a direct parallel to the supposed mass hysteria that followed Orson Welles' 1938 War of the Worlds radio broadcast.
Which was itself largely a myth, that hysteria.
It was, but it was a useful story.
And Keyhoe didn't stop there. Historian Mark Gulius argues that Keyhoe was instrumental in popularizing one of the most lasting memes, the government cover-up of the truth about UFOs.
And by 1955, Keyhoe's belief had hardened into his major work, The Flying Saucer Conspiracy. This is where he argued that a dedicated high-level silence group within the government was orchestrating this massive conspiracy.
So for him, the cover-up itself became the central theme.
It became the most important to him, absolutely. The focus shifted permanently from what the saucers were to why the government was hiding them.
And there's this moment on live TV that just cemented the idea of official silencing.
Yes, 1958. It's an incredible story. Kehoe was appearing on CBS's Armstrong Circle Theater. He deviated from the pre-approved script.
And what happened?
He announced he was going to reveal something that has never been disclosed before, and his microphone was literally cut mid-sentence by the production crew.
Which, to anyone watching, must have looked like the most blatant censorship imaginable.
It was an unbelievable accident that served the conspiracy narrative perfectly. Millions of people genuinely believed that the Air Force, or some shadowy agency, had physically and audibly silenced him on television.
So by cutting the audio, CBS inadvertently gave him this huge validation.
Far greater than anything he had actually intended to say. It completely cemented the persecution narrative for believers everywhere.
Now, at the same time, Kehoe is popularizing the cover-up. The mythology of crashed ships and recovered alien bodies starts to emerge.
It does. It starts with the 1949 Aztec, New Mexico incident. A journalist named Frank Scully claimed in his Variety magazine columns that dead extraterrestrials had been recovered from a 100-foot diameter saucer.
He then wrote a book about it.
Behind the Flying Saucers in 1950. It provided all these specific technical details that seemed credible to a public that was just eager for insider knowledge.
But this one was debunked pretty quickly.
Very quickly and very effectively by True magazine, the same magazine that published Kehoe. They exposed Scully as a victim of two veteran confidence artists. Exactly. These guys ran a business selling bogus oil drilling equipment, and they had fed Scully the entire fabricated story of the crash and the bodies.
But despite the rapid exposure of this fraud, the core idea crashed ships and alien bodies, it persisted.
It did. Air Force investigator James McAndrew noted that this specific narrative blueprint became a powerful catalyst for later, much more famous, crashed saucer stories.
Most notably, Roswell.
Most notably, the resurrection of the Roswell incident almost 30 years later. It showed that once a core idea is planted, debunking it doesn't mean it goes away.
And the government's response during this time often seemed to, inadvertently fuel the very theories they were trying to suppress.
Oh, absolutely. Like in July 1952, the Air Force had to hold the largest press conference since World War II to address all the sightings over Washington, D.C.
And General John Samford, who led the conference, he attributed most of it to things like temperature inversion.
He did. He offered mundane explanations. But even he couldn't offer a completely unified front. He famously acknowledged receiving reports from credible observers of relatively incredible things.
Which leaves the door wide open.
It does. And the subsequent Robertson panel, which was convened to analyze the situation, went further. They recommended a public education campaign.
Which was basically a program of strategic ridicule.
Exactly. The goal was to reduce the public interest in flying saucers. So the official solution wasn't just to investigate. It was to actively convince the public that the whole topic was absurd.
Which, to a conspiracy theorist, sounds exactly like the definition of a cover-up.
Precisely. The narrative of official deception was solidified not by aliens, but by the government's own policy of calculated public relations.
And some of the friction was coming from inside the Air Force itself.
It was. Captain Edward Ruppelt, who was the director of Project Grudge and Project Blue Book, published a book in 1956, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects.
And he was critical of the Air Force.
He openly criticized their haphazard and often dismissive handling of UFO investigations. He was arguing for better methodology.
But here's the paradox. His statements, which were meant as an honest call for internal reform,
were immediately seized upon by believers and converted into further powerful proof of a cover-up.
Because he admitted there were problems inside.
Yes. His internal administrative criticism was perceived as corroboration that the government had profound secrets to hide, even though Ruppelt himself never claimed to have found any alien technology.
The 1950s also saw the full maturation of the Men in Black archetype.
It moved beyond that one brief encounter in the Maury Island hoax. Gray Barker's 1956 book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, popularized the idea of these sinister figures threatening witnesses to ensure their silence.
And the MIB concept was effective because it had this sort of grain of truth, right? Government agencies certainly did try to quietly discourage public interest.
They did. But Barker embellished the facts wildly. And it's illuminating that later, Barker and a collaborator actually admitted that they had worked together on a brief fictional notice about the Men in Black. which they then deliberately published as fact.
So they were actively manufacturing the evidence.
They were, prioritizing a dramatic narrative over truthful investigation.
The final major conspiracy of the 1950s that really cemented this idea of government secrecy was the Philadelphia experiment.
A very strange story detailed in Morris K. Jessup's 1955 book, The Case for the UFO. Jessup received these bizarre letters from someone calling himself Carlos Miguel Allende.
Later identified as Carl Meredith Allen.
Yes, and he detailed this dangerous Navy experiment in 1943 where the USS Eldridge was allegedly made invisible and teleported from Philadelphia to Virginia.
And the story took a very dramatic turn when Jessup was contacted by the Office of Naval Research.
That's right, they showed him a copy of his own book, and this copy was heavily annotated with handwritten notes in 3 different shades of ink.
And the notes discussed alien races and space travel.
And most critically, they expressed deep concern that Jessup was getting too close to discovering the government's secret technology. It suggested an internal, high-level debate about concealment that Jessup was accidentally exposing.
But the reality was much simpler.
Simpler in its construction, but darker in its outcome. Allen later confessed that he authored all the annotations himself. His specific motive, he said, was to scare the hell out of Jessup.
It was a psychological game.
It was. And tragically, Jessup died by suicide in 1959. This tragedy was immediately co-opted by conspiracy authors, who seized upon his death as suspicious, linking it directly to his discoveries.
Reinforcing the idea that the Silence Group would use fatal means to protect their secrets.
Exactly. The legacy of secrecy had now shifted from mysterious black cars to actual death. So the 1960s and 70s, this is really the critical inflection point for the cover-up narrative. This is when it moves from the fringe right into the political mainstream.
And that's because the decade was just defined by this profound disillusionment.
Absolutely. You have the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the revelations in the Pentagon Papers, and of course the political scandal of Watergate.
These events just fundamentally eroded public faith in American institutions.
They did. And it created this incredibly fertile ground for the UFO cover-up narrative to flourish. It permanently shifted the public consensus from, the government protects us to the government lies to us.
And in this climate of profound skepticism, the ghost of the 1947 Maury Island hoax actually returns.
It does, adding this sinister historical thread to all the contemporary political turmoil. Fred Chrisman, the original hoaxer, was subpoenaed by the controversial prosecutor Jim Garrison during his prosecution of Clay Shaw for involvement in the JFK assassination.
So there was a direct link, however tenuous, between the first MIB story and the JFK investigation.
Correct. And although Chrisman's involvement was dubious and circumstantial, that link was enough for later authors to allege that Kennedy's death was intrinsically tied to a UFO cover-up.
The theory being that he was killed because he was about to disclose the alien presence.
Exactly. This narrative solidified the idea that government secrecy wasn't just administrative, but that it extended to high-level political murder.
And then there was this major symbolic moment of public ridicule that really amplified the distrust.
1966, the infamous swamp gas explanation for the mass sightings in Michigan.
The Air Force civilian investigator J. Allen Hynek was just widely derided for attempting to attribute these bizarre reports to decaying organic material.
And the term swamp gas, just like weather balloon before it, instantly became shorthand for any official explanation that the public found implausible or, frankly, insulting.
And the sheer force of that ridicule seems to have driven Hynek himself to a radical change of heart.
It really did. By 1974, Hynek, the former official scientific advisor to the Air Force, publicly charged that Project Blue Book, the very program he had advised, was, in fact, a cosmic Watergate.
That's a powerful accusation.
A very powerful accusation, equating the Air Force's policies on UFOs with the deception of the Nixon administration. He stated that 20% of the cases remained unexplained, a significant number that believers seized upon as proof of suppressed evidence.
Meanwhile, the legends of crashed alien bodies, which had been debunked during the Aztec hoax, reemerged with renewed force in the mid-70s.
And this time, the story centered on a very specific location, Hangar 18.
Science fiction author Robert Spencer Carr alleged in 1974 that bodies recovered from the Aztec crash were secretly stored in this mythical Hangar 18 at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
And the specific terminology here is critical, because it shows fiction leading the way again. The Air Force refuted this, explaining that no structure called Hangar 18 even existed at the base.
And they noted the similarity between Carr's claim and a fictional novel.
Yes, the 1968 novel The Fortic Conspiracy. This highlights this recurring self-referential loop where conspiracy theories constantly draw their specific details directly from previous works of fiction, which then become accepted as facts.
And perhaps the most lasting and psychologically impactful contribution of the mid-70s was the introduction of a terrifying new element: alien abductions.
Yes, this began when the 1975 NBC film, The UFO Incident, dramatized the 1961 Betty and Barney Hill case.
This film was critically important because it was the first widely disseminated account of the now familiar gray alien archetype.
That's right, short, slender, with the large wraparound eyes.
But the mechanism by which the Hill story was developed, it raises some major concerns.
It does, and we have to examine this closely. The testimony relied heavily on recovered memory therapy. From a scientific standpoint, this technique is highly problematic.
Because the memories recovered under hypnosis are often indistinguishable from false memories.
Exactly. They can be generated or suggested during the therapeutic process. Skeptics, including the noted psychologist Dr. Benjamin Simon, argue that after viewing a movie like that, anyone with a little imagination could become an instant celebrity by developing a consistent narrative under hypnosis.
It created a template.
A standardized template for future abduction claims.
And one of those instant celebrities appeared almost immediately.
The Travis Walton incident in 1975, which followed the TV film by just 2 weeks. Walton's crew reported he had been abducted by a flying saucer while working in Arizona.
But there were strong suspicions of a hoax.
Very strong. Writers like Philip J. Klass highlighted a significant potential financial motive. The crew needed an act of God event to avoid a steep contract penalty from the Forestry Service for failing to meet a deadline.
So given the timing, it's widely regarded as a probable hoax.
Even among many early UFO proponents, yes. Yet it became a milestone in the growing abduction mythology.
Then Hollywood stepped in to give the suppression narrative maximum global currency.
Spielberg's 1977 blockbuster, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It dramatically portrayed a global government cover-up involving the military and the scientific community.
And critically, the film included a subplot suggesting an exchange program where humans voluntarily went with the aliens.
A detail that perfectly foreshadowed and provided the creative vocabulary for later, much darker conspiracy narratives like Project Serpo.
And finally, the story that was to define the mythology for the next 50 years, Roswell.
The Roswell story, which had been dormant since 1947, resurfaced in 1978. Ufologist Stanton Friedman interviewed Jesse Marcel, the only person known to have transported the debris from the recovery site.
And Marcel revealed that the 1947 weather balloon explanation was without a doubt a cover story.
That was the crucial moment. He admitted he hadn't been at liberty to comment in 1947 and that he and the military knew the debris was something unearthly.
But it's fundamentally important to note that even while he was speculating the debris was extraterrestrial, Marcel consistently denied the presence of alien bodies.
This is a critical point. In all his subsequent statements, he denied there were bodies. This proves the alien body component, which is now central to the Roswell myth, was a secondary invention, added later by other theorists, filling a narrative gap that Marcel himself had explicitly left empty. The 1980s marked a profound and a deeply troubling shift in the evolution of these theories. Scholars later termed it ufology's dark side.
The mythology metastasized from simple government paternalism, hiding the truth to prevent panic, to something much more frightening.
Much more. The new mythology alleged that a shadowy government cabal was secretly cooperating with a race of malevolent aliens,
allowing practices like cattle mutilation and human abduction in exchange for technology.
Exactly. The enemy was no longer just the lying government. It was the government in collusion with something evil.
And this dark shift coincided with some disturbing, difficult-to-explain real-world phenomena.
Specifically, the numerous reports of cattle mutilations near the Colorado-New Mexico border, particularly around the small town of Dulce, New Mexico.
Ranchers were reporting unusual lights, UFOs, and most intriguingly, quiet helicopters linked to these gruesome events.
The quiet helicopters became a potent symbol of covert government action. At the time, the existence of such silent aircraft was dismissed as fantastical.
But it turned out to be real.
It did. Pilkington notes that the silent helicopter has now been revealed as a reality, one that was flying as long ago as 1972, the Hughes 500P penetrator, or the quiet one.
So linking real, covert military technology to the phenomena just fueled the theories that the government was complicit.
It did. And you also had competing narratives. some alleged alien activity, but there was also the possibility of covert epidemiological monitoring related to the 1967 underground nuclear detonation nearby, known as Project Gasbuggy.
Now, this is where the story takes a turn from cultural phenomenon to documented tragedy and political deception.
It is. The entire new mythology of government alien collusion was largely synthesized and disseminated by one person, Air Force Agent Richard Doty.
A special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations stationed at Kirtland Air Force Base.
And Doty was the central, intentional source for much of this new malevolent mythology, and we must examine his actions regarding a man named Paul Bennewitz with extreme seriousness and compassion.
Who was Bennewitz?
He was an amateur UFO investigator, a small business owner. Doty deliberately befriended him and proceeded to feed him an elaborate and entirely fabricated series of stories.
Sophisticated lies, really.
Very sophisticated lies, detailing a massive UFO conspiracy, secret government treaties with aliens, and alien harvesting of cattle and humans.
And the intent was to use psychological warfare to discredit Bennewitz because he was successfully tracking some legitimate but sensitive government testing?
That's right. The Air Force wanted it covered up. The result of this targeted, intense psychological deception was devastating. Bennewitz, believing he had uncovered the most horrifying truth in human history, was ultimately institutionalized.
He was hospitalized for severe paranoia.
After being targeted and deceived by Doty and his collaborators. This is a clear, documented case where an Air Force agent intentionally manufactured a psychological trauma and destroyed a civilian investigator. We have to acknowledge the real human cost of these deception campaigns.
And Doty's disinformation efforts were not limited to a single victim.
No. He also targeted the documentarian Linda Moulton Howe, who was investigating cattle mutilations. In 1983, Doty showed her fabricated documents purporting to be presidential briefing papers.
The so-called Kirtland Papers.
Exactly. Detailing UFO crashes at Roswell, the recovery of surviving aliens, and the existence of the supposed MJ-12 group.
And how, trusting this highly placed military source, she became a staunch advocate for these dark conspiracy theories.
She did. And this had a tremendous effect, amplifying Doty's creative mythology to a much wider audience. Years later, Doty partially confessed his role, admitting, "We gave Linda some bad information,"
confirming that key proponents of these theories were, in fact, unknowing conduits of a military disinformation campaign.
a campaign designed to spread false, complex conspiracy stories.
And this disinformation campaign culminated in the most famous of all UFO cover-up documents, the Majestic 12 or MJ-12 hoax.
Yes, the earliest known reference to MJ-12 actually comes from a 1981 document that was used in the psychological targeting and manipulation of Paul Bennewitz.
So as part of that same campaign.
Part of the same campaign. The fabricated documents detailed this alleged group, Majestic 12, formed by President Truman to handle the Roswell retrieval.
And the documents achieved public fame in 1984, sent anonymously to a filmmaker,
Jaime Shandera. It came shortly after a phone call from Bill Moore, who was later revealed to be working with Doty.
And Moore made a stunning confession later on.
At a 1989 MUFON conference, he admitted that he had intentionally fed fake evidence of extraterrestrials to researchers.
And the documents themselves, they were ultimately discredited for multiple technical reasons.
Compelling reasons. Carl Sagan criticized the complete lack of provenance, calling it miraculously dropped on a doorstep like something out of a fairy story.
There were non-standard date formats.
And most damningly, a purported signature from President Truman was demonstrated to have been photocopied identically from another completely unrelated document. Moore even admitted to typing and stamping it himself as a facsimile.
And yet, even though Moore's confession turned the community against him personally, the MJ-12 conspiracy theory itself persisted.
It did. Ironically, it became the foundational blueprint for virtually all subsequent Roswell and cover-up stories.
Doty's manufactured mythology had massive influence, particularly through John Lear,
the son of the Learjet founder. He was described as probably the most influential source of UFO conspiracy information in the late 1980s.
And he was heavily influenced and directly fed by Doty's fake evidence.
He was. Lear collaborated closely with Bill Cooper, who claimed he'd witnessed a massive metal craft while serving in the Navy. Together, they released this radical indictment against the U.S. government for aiding and abetting and concealing this alien nation.
This is where ufology becomes explicitly political and highly adversarial.
Very much so. Cooper's 1991 book, Behold a Pale Horse, became an unlikely phenomenon, claiming JFK was killed because he threatened to reveal the alien presence. The book became extremely popular, especially in the U.S. prison system.
And Cooper himself was shot and killed by law enforcement during an attempted arrest in 2001.
A very violent end.
The third major figure emerging from this Doty-influenced circle was Bob Lazar.
Yes. Lear introduced the journalist George Knapp to Lazar, who claimed to have worked reverse engineering alien technology at a secret facility called S4 near the infamous Area 51.
Lazar's claims really fueled the Area 51 mythos, which was crucial for the 1990s cultural explosion.
It was, but his claims were widely discredited. Investigators revealed he did not hold the degrees he claimed from MIT and Caltech. Furthermore, he was convicted for felony pandering in 1990.
Despite these verifiable facts, he remains a prominent figure in media today.
Which demonstrates the resilience of the charismatic whistleblower narrative, especially when it validates a pre-existing belief.
And to close the chapter on Doty, he continued this pattern of deception well into the 2000s.
He did, operating anonymous email accounts to spread the fictional Project Serpo stories, the supposed exchange program where Americans were sent to an alien homeworld. Doty eventually admitted his role in these fabrications in the 2013 documentary Mirage Men,
reinforcing the disturbing fact that many of the most dramatic cover-up stories of the last 40 years were intentionally seeded by military intelligence.
As we transition into the 1990s, these complex, layered narratives, which were often based on hoaxes and psychological operations, they moved rapidly from the fringe right into the absolute center of popular culture.
This era saw a massive proliferation of conspiracy media. Historian David Goldberg observed that the image of the gray alien became the smiley face of the 1990s.
That's a great way to put it. And the most powerful cultural synthesizer of this was undoubtedly the X-Files.
Premiered in 1993, its famous mantra, "Trust no one," just perfectly summarized the prevailing conspiracist suspicion that the government was the true primary threat.
And the show skillfully wove together all the established myths that had developed over decades. The Roswell cover-up, the MIB, the alien treaty myths, the secret military bunkers,
into one unified, digestible, and extremely popular narrative that just resonated globally.
And cinema further amplified this. Independence Day in 1996 introduced a global audience to the idea of a recovered Roswell craft being secretly stored at Area 51, making that base a household name.
The following year, Men in Black recast the secretive figures as comic heroes, but it also cemented the concept in popular culture.
Right, and it offered this meta-commentary on the long history of government debunking by combining swamp gas and weather balloon into a single, absurd official explanation.
But despite the maturation of the mythology, the era was still characterized by these calculated hoaxes aimed at profit.
Yes. In 1995, you have the pseudo-documentary Alien Autopsy, fact or fiction, released by the British entrepreneur Ray Santilli.
The grainy, seemingly old footage purporting to show an autopsy from right after the Roswell crash. It aired globally and sparked this intense debate.
But the analysis of the source material confirms it was completely fake. The footage was filmed on an inexpensive set built in a London living room.
And the alleged alien bodies
were detailed hollow plaster casts filled with awful sheep brains, and this is a memorable detail raspberry jam to simulate internal organs.
Santilli later admitted in 2006 that the film was a fake.
He did. But the image of the alien autopsy was indelibly burned into the public consciousness. It just shows that a manufactured, visually compelling hoax can endure far longer than its subsequent debunking.
We also see the continued blending of these suppression stories with the spiritual draw of alien visitors.
Definitely. In 1997, you have the widespread sightings known as the Phoenix Lights. Days later, 39 members of the Heaven's Gate religious group died in a coordinated mass suicide.
They were convinced an alien craft trailing the Hale-Bopp comet would save them.
And the political reaction to the Phoenix Lights was also illuminating. The governor of Arizona, Fife Symington III, initially joked about it.
But later he admitted he'd had a personal encounter himself.
He did in 2007. He said he had seen a massive, inexplicable spacecraft, but he kept silent about it because he didn't want to panic the populace.
Which is a real-world validation of the exact rationale that Kehoe had originally posited back in the 50s.
Precisely. And this confluence of belief, government suppression stories, and spiritualism led to the formalized disclosure movement, founded by Stephen N. Greer in 1993.
This movement explicitly advocates for the government to officially release all classified information on alien contact.
This belief that full disclosure is the necessary goal, it's not new. As far back as 1946, the editor of Amazing Stories argued that if you thought government officials were ignorant of spaceships, you just don't think the way we do.
And the modern wave of this phenomenon really began in 2017 with the New York Times story on the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or ATIP.
Yes, which studied unidentified aerial phenomena. The program's former director, Luis Elizondo, became a major proponent, claiming a high-level government conspiracy to suppress evidence of non-human intelligence.
Basically taking Kehoe's silence group concept and updating it for the 21st century.
And this momentum accelerated further in 2023 with the claims of former intelligence officer David Grush.
Grush alleged that the U.S. government is concealing multi-decade programs to retrieve and reverse engineer UFOs. His claims became a massive public story.
Many saw it as the definitive indication that long-awaited disclosure was finally imminent. However, Grush's story was significantly criticized for its lack of publicly verifiable evidence.
West notes that he relied almost entirely on what he claimed he'd been told by unnamed sources.
Things he stated he could not share in detail due to security constraints. So while the reports are influential, the consensus among the scientific community is that these sweeping conspiratorial claims are broadly considered untrue.
And in a fascinating and highly revealing development, recent official context confirms that intentional, sophisticated disinformation is not just historical, but recent and internal.
Yes, a 2025 report revealed that hundreds of Air Force personnel had been told, falsely, that there was a secret program to harvest alien technology. It was described as a long-running practice that acted like a fraternity hazing ritual that spun wildly out of control.
So high-level government figures were actively subjected to and used in the spread of complex, false stories about alien retrieval program.
It's perhaps the perfect synthesis of the entire timeline we've reviewed. It confirms that the line between genuine government secrecy and intentional disinformation has been blurred, often deliberately.
We also have a recent prosaic explanation for an old mystery. The report mentioned that a classified electromagnetic pulse test was responsible for the 1967 missile incidents, which had long fueled cover-up theories.
So we've spent this time tracing the incredible resilience and the manufactured evolution of these narratives. It's remarkable how dramatically they shifted over time.
From the relatively benign space brothers hidden away in the 1950s,
to the complex paranoid structures involving government cabals, murder, and malevolent aliens in the 80s and 90s. And the sources show us that these narratives were often amplified or even deliberately created and maintained by calculated intentional disinformation campaigns.
Campaigns orchestrated by military intelligence, which resulted in real and documented harm to individuals like Paul Benowitz.
Exactly.
So as we see these narratives about cover-ups shift dramatically based on decades of distrust born from events like JFK, the Pentagon Papers, and Watergate, we have to ask a final question for you to consider. Given that modern reports indicate high-level government figures were intentionally subjected to false stories about alien retrieval programs, a psychological technique used decades ago on the civilian Paul Benowitz, how does understanding this deep history of institutional and military disinformation fundamentally change how we evaluate every subsequent claim of suppression, even those from self-proclaimed whistleblowers? Thank you for joining us for this extensive analysis of the source material.
We hope this helps you process this complex and enduring history of belief and deception.
Thanks for listening.